The laughter echoed through the executive lobby. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from joy. It was the kind that left scars. "Careful, old man." CEO Victor Langley sneered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That floor is probably the most valuable thing you'll ever touch." The executives around him chuckled. The elderly janitor lowered his eyes, quietly picked up the folder Victor had intentionally knocked from his hands, and simply replied, "You're right, sir. Some things are more valuable than people realize." Victor smirked. "Just clean the floor." No one noticed that every member of the board had just stepped out of the elevator behind them. And no one noticed that one board member had completely frozen the moment he recognized the janitor. At exactly 5:15 every morning, before the first executive arrived, Samuel Carter unlocked the side entrance of Langley Technologies. At 72 years old, his movements were slower than they had once been, but every motion remained precise. He polished the marble floors until they reflected the ceiling lights like glass. He watered every plant. He replaced burned-out bulbs before anyone noticed. He greeted every security guard by name. Nobody ever greeted him first. To most employees, Samuel was invisible. Some never even learned his name. He wasn't bitter, or at least that's what everyone assumed. Every morning he carried the same faded lunchbox. Every afternoon he ate alone on the rooftop overlooking downtown Chicago. Every evening he left exactly at 6. Routine had become his armor. But routines always hide secrets. Victor Langley believed routines existed for weaker people. At 45, he had transformed Langley Technologies into one of America's fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies. Business magazines called him brilliant. Financial reporters called him fearless. Employees called him something else whenever he wasn't listening. Victor demanded perfection. He rewarded results. He had absolutely no patience for mistakes, especially from people he considered replaceable. He often told his executives, if someone can be replaced in a week, they're not an asset, they're an expense. Most people nodded. Some secretly hated him. None dared challenge him, except one person, not openly, not yet. Samuel had worked in the building for almost 6 years. Curiously, no one had ever seen him apply for the job. Human resources couldn't even remember interviewing him. The paperwork had simply existed. Whenever someone asked how long he'd been there, answers were always different. 3 years. No, 5. I think he started before COVID. Nobody really knew, and somehow, nobody cared enough to find out. But someone had. Emily Brooks, the company's youngest financial analyst, 30 years old, quiet, sharp, obsessed with details. Emily noticed things other people ignored. Like how Samuel always carried an expensive fountain pen despite wearing patched work clothes. How he occasionally corrected grammatical mistakes in executive presentations left in conference rooms. How security guards treated him with unusual respect. How visiting investors sometimes stared at him as if trying to remember where they'd seen him before. None of it made sense, which made Emily curious. One rainy Tuesday morning, she found Samuel sitting alone in the cafeteria reading the Wall Street Journal, not the business section, the legal section. He folded the newspaper carefully before smiling. "You should always read the last page first." Emily laughed. "Why?" "Because that's usually where they hide the truth." Before she could ask what he meant, Victor stormed into the cafeteria. "There you are." Everyone turned. Victor wasn't talking to Emily. He was pointing directly at Samuel. "I asked for coffee in the executive boardroom 15 minutes ago." Samuel stood immediately. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't informed." Victor rolled his eyes dramatically. "Do I really have to explain everything around here?" Several employees awkwardly looked away. Emily felt uncomfortable. Samuel simply nodded. "I'll prepare it now." Victor leaned closer. "You know what your problem is?" Samuel remained silent. "You move like someone who's already retired." A few nervous laughs escaped nearby tables. Victor smiled proudly. "Maybe it's time you actually retired." Samuel looked at him for a long second. Not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. Sometimes experience arrives before wisdom. Victor frowned. "What does that even mean?" Samuel politely nodded. "It means your coffee will be ready shortly." Victor walked away, shaking his head. Emily watched Samuel quietly prepare the tray himself. His hands never trembled, but something in his eyes had changed, only for a second, then it disappeared. Later that afternoon, Emily couldn't stop thinking about him. She searched the employee database. Nothing unusual, except his emergency contact section was blank. His previous employment history listed only one word: confidential. That wasn't possible. Company software didn't allow entries like that. She refreshed the page. Still there. Confidential. Who approved that? Meanwhile, on the top floor, Victor prepared for the quarterly board meeting. The company had exceeded revenue expectations again. Investors were thrilled. The media adored him. He expected another effortless victory. His assistant entered nervously. Sir, the board added someone to today's attendance list. Victor barely looked up. Another consultant? No, she hesitated. They didn't explain. Victor sighed. I don't care. Whoever it is, they'll be impressed. He always believed confidence solved everything. Sometimes, confidence simply blinded people. Across the building, Samuel quietly polished the brass plaque outside the board conference room. One executive accidentally bumped into him. Sorry, Samuel smiled warmly. No harm done. As the executive hurried inside, he whispered to another manager, I swear I've seen that janitor somewhere before. His colleague shrugged. Maybe at the grocery store. No. The executive looked back once more. It was somewhere much more important. Before he could remember, the meeting doors closed. The memory vanished. For now. That evening, Emily stayed late finishing reports. The office was nearly empty. As she walked past the executive archives, she noticed the door slightly open. Inside, Samuel stood alone. He wasn't cleaning. He was staring at an old framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed the company's founders nearly 30 years earlier. One face had been removed from the picture, cut out, perfectly. Samuel gently touched the empty space. His expression wasn't sadness, it was regret. Then he whispered words Emily barely managed to hear. They still don't know why I left. Emily accidentally stepped on a loose floor tile. The sound echoed. Samuel immediately turned around. For a brief second, his calm expression disappeared. Not with fear, with recognition. As if he had expected someone to discover him eventually. He smiled again. Working late? Emily nodded. So are you. Samuel looked once more at the damaged photograph. Some stories, he said quietly, are buried because powerful people need them buried. Emily looked at the empty frame. Whose picture was removed? Samuel answered without looking at her. The wrong man's. Before Emily could ask another question, the hallway lights suddenly switched off automatically for the night. When they turned back on a few seconds later, Samuel was already gone. Only the photograph remained. And for the first time in years, Emily realized the company's greatest mystery wasn't hidden in its financial records. It was pushing a mop through the hallways every single morning. Emily barely slept that night. Samuel's words kept replaying in her mind. The wrong man's. He hadn't sounded like a janitor remembering company history. He had sounded like someone remembering his own life. The next morning, she arrived at the office before sunrise, for the first time in years. She wanted answers before the building came alive. Instead, she found another mystery. Samuel was already there, not cleaning, standing silently in front of the American flag in the lobby. For a full minute, he simply looked at it before putting on his work gloves and beginning his routine. No phone, no music, no distractions, just discipline. Emily couldn't explain why, but something about him reminded her of an old military officer rather than a maintenance worker. The question was no longer who was Samuel. It had become who had he been? Victor Langley arrived 2 hours later in his brand new electric sports car. Every executive stopped to admire it. Victor loved moments like these. Admiration fueled him almost as much as success. He tossed his keys toward the valet without looking. The keys missed. They landed directly inside a flower bed Samuel had finished planting only minutes earlier. Samuel quietly retrieved them and walked over. You dropped these, sir. Victor took the keys without saying thank you. You know, Carter, he said loudly enough for nearby employees to hear, I sometimes wonder if you're still working because you enjoy cleaning, or because nobody else would hire you. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. Samuel only smiled politely. I've learned that a person's work says less about them than the way they treat people doing it. Victor chuckled. Nice philosophy. He leaned closer. Unfortunately, philosophy doesn't increase shareholder value. As Victor walked away, Emily noticed something strange. Samuel wasn't watching him. He was watching the board's private elevator, as if he knew someone important was about to arrive, but no one did. At least, no one was supposed to. Later that morning, Emily accessed the company's digital archives again. This time she bypassed the employee records. She searched something different. Founders. The company website listed only two, Richard Langley, Thomas Grayson, both celebrated as visionaries. But while browsing scanned newspaper articles from 30 years ago, Emily found an old headline. 3 engineers launch revolutionary software firm. 3? She enlarged the photograph. Richard, Thomas, and the third man's face had been scratched away with black ink. Someone had physically destroyed every copy. Emily frowned. That wasn't an accident. Someone wanted history rewritten. The article mentioned only one surviving sentence beneath the damaged image. The company's financial architecture was designed by former engineer. The rest was unreadable. Emily felt a chill. Meanwhile, Samuel quietly entered storage room B12 carrying a bucket. Instead of cleaning supplies, the room contained hundreds of old archive boxes waiting for destruction. He carefully opened one. Inside were annual reports dating back nearly 3 decades. He searched without hesitation, as though he already knew exactly where everything was. Finally, he found a worn leather notebook. He gently brushed the dust away. A single tear almost escaped before he closed it again. Not yet, he whispered. The notebook returned to the box. Seconds later, someone entered. It was Frank Dawson, head of security. Frank immediately looked suspicious. "What are you doing in here?" Samuel calmly held up the empty bucket, looking for replacement light bulbs. Frank stared at him. He wasn't convinced, but he couldn't prove anything. "Next time, ask permission." Samuel nodded. Of course. As Samuel left, Frank quietly opened the same box. Nothing looked unusual. Still, his instincts told him something was wrong. Emily decided to speak with someone who had worked at the company longer than anyone else, Margaret, the 70-year-old receptionist. She had seen 3 CEOs, hundreds of executives, thousands of employees. Emily approached carefully. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret smiled. "If it's about Samuel, you're not the first." Emily blinked. "You know?" Margaret looked around before lowering her voice. "When he first arrived 6 years ago," she hesitated. "The board personally approved his hiring." Emily froze. "The board?" Margaret nodded. "No interview, no references, no paperwork. They simply said." She stopped. "Said what?" Margaret sighed. "Treat him with respect." Emily's heartbeat accelerated. "Then why does everyone treat him like he's invisible?" Margaret looked sadly toward the lobby. "Because new people copied the old people, and after a while, it became normal." Emily walked away even more confused. If the board wanted Samuel respected, why had they never defended him? That afternoon, Victor prepared for an important investor presentation worth nearly $2 billion. Everything had to be perfect. But 15 minutes before the meeting, disaster struck. The presentation servers crashed. Screens went black. Executives panicked. Engineers rushed through the conference room. Nobody understood what had happened. Victor exploded. "I pay millions for technology, and none of you can fix a projector?" Sweat covered every technician's face. The investors were already arriving. Then, a quiet voice came from the doorway. "May I make a suggestion?" Everyone turned. Samuel stood holding a mop. Victor laughed sarcastically. "The janitor knows computers now?" Several executives laughed with him. Samuel remained calm. "The backup server is still running." Silence. The IT director frowned. "That's impossible," Samuel answered confidently. "It was installed on a separate emergency circuit." The director shook his head. "No, it wasn't." Samuel simply looked at him. "It was." 5 minutes later, the IT department checked. Samuel was right. The backup server existed exactly where he described. It restored the entire presentation. Investors never noticed the problem. Victor received a standing ovation. But instead of thanking Samuel, Victor looked irritated. Must have been lucky. The IT director wasn't smiling anymore. "Sir, I've worked here 14 years. I didn't know that server existed." Victor ignored him. But Emily didn't. How could a janitor know the company's original emergency infrastructure better than senior engineers? Unless he had helped design it. Late that evening, Emily couldn't resist any longer. Emergency infrastructure better than senior engineers. Unless he had helped design it. Late that evening, Emily couldn't resist any longer. She followed Samuel after work. He didn't drive. He took the subway, then walked another mile through an older neighborhood. Finally, he entered a modest brick apartment building. No luxury, no expensive car, nothing that suggested hidden wealth. Emily felt embarrassed. Maybe she had imagined everything. As she turned to leave, an elegant black sedan quietly pulled up outside. A gray-haired man in an expensive suit stepped out. He looked wealthy, powerful. He respectfully opened the passenger door, not for himself, for Samuel. Samuel climbed inside. The suited man nodded politely before driving away. Emily quickly took a taxi and followed them. 20 minutes later, the sedan stopped in front of an exclusive private club where memberships reportedly cost more than most people's annual salaries. Samuel stepped out. The doorman immediately greeted him. "Good evening, Mr. Carter." Not sir, not janitor, Mr. Carter, with unmistakable respect. Samuel disappeared inside. Emily waited outside for almost an hour. When he finally emerged, 3 elderly businessmen walked him to the entrance. All 3 shook his hand. One even hugged him. They looked nothing like employers. They looked like equals, or perhaps old friends. As Samuel left, one of the men quietly said, "We can't keep hiding forever." Samuel answered without slowing his steps, "I'm not hiding. I'm waiting." Waiting for what? Emily had no idea. But she was certain of one thing. Samuel Carter wasn't pretending to be important. He was pretending not to be. And somewhere inside Langley Technologies, someone was terrified that the truth would finally come out. The quarterly board meeting began at exactly 9 a.m. Victor Langley stood confidently at the head of the polished conference table. Behind him, giant screens displayed soaring stock prices, record-breaking revenue, and headlines praising his leadership. "This," Victor said with a smile, "has been the most successful quarter in company history." The board applauded politely. Emily sat near the back, unable to focus on the presentation. She kept glancing toward the closed doors. She had barely slept after following Samuel the night before. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. Victor clicked to his final slide. "Our future has never looked brighter." Just then, the conference room doors opened. Samuel Carter entered quietly, carrying a tray of coffee. Victor sighed dramatically. Perfect timing. He turned toward the board. "Allow me to introduce the hardest working man in the building." A few executives smiled awkwardly. Victor continued, "Our janitor somehow manages to appear in every important meeting." Several people laughed. Samuel calmly placed each coffee cup in front of the board members. When he reached the end of the table, one elderly director suddenly stood up, then another, then another. Within seconds, every member of the board was standing. Victor frowned. "What are you doing?" No one answered him. Instead, board chairman Harold Whitmore walked toward Samuel. Without saying a word, the 78-year-old chairman extended his hand. "No," he corrected himself softly. Then he embraced Samuel like an old friend. "It's been too long." The room fell completely silent. Victor stared in disbelief. Emily felt her heart racing. Harold turned toward everyone. "I believe it's time." Samuel sighed quietly. "I was hoping for one more year." Harold smiled sadly. "So was I. But some lessons can't wait forever." The chairman returned to his seat. He looked directly at Victor. "You asked me 6 months ago why the board never interfered with your management decisions." Victor nodded slowly. "Yes." Harold folded his hands. "Because we made a promise." Victor looked confused. "A promise to whom?" Harold turned toward Samuel. "To the man who built this company." Victor laughed. "I'm sorry. I think you've confused him with someone else." Harold's expression never changed. "No, I haven't." He picked up an old leather folder. Inside were original incorporation documents, 32 years old. 3 signatures appeared at the bottom. Richard Langley, Thomas Grayson, Samuel Carter. Victor blinked. "No." Harold slid another document across the table. The original patent. Same signature. Then another. The first investor agreement. Same signature. Another. Blueprints. Bank approvals. Employment contracts. Every foundation of Langley Technologies carried Samuel's name. Emily covered her mouth. The room became perfectly still. Victor forced a laugh. "This has to be some kind of joke." Samuel finally spoke. "It isn't." Samuel slowly removed his work gloves. For the first time, everyone noticed the old burn scars covering his hands. "I wasn't the 3rd founder." He looked around the room. "I was the first." Silence. "I designed the company's original software architecture. I negotiated the first investments. I wrote the first business plan. I even chose the company's name." Victor's confidence began to crumble. "My father never mentioned you." Samuel nodded. "I know. He made sure of that." Samuel walked toward the large windows overlooking Chicago. "When the company was worth almost nothing," he said quietly, "Richard was my best friend. We dreamed together. We failed together. We borrowed money together. We believed success would never change us." He smiled sadly. "We were wrong. As investors arrived, so did greed." Samuel explained that Richard had secretly altered ownership agreements while Samuel was recovering in the hospital after a serious factory accident. The accident had permanently damaged Samuel's hands. Unable to code for long hours anymore, he trusted his closest friend to protect the company they had built together. Instead, Richard quietly erased Samuel from every legal document he could manipulate. The lawsuits lasted years. Samuel eventually won recognition, but not revenge. Because before the final judgment, Richard died unexpectedly. Ownership passed to his family, including a young Victor. I could have destroyed everything, Samuel admitted. I had enough evidence. The courts offered me nearly half the company. Everyone stared. Then why didn't you take it? Emily asked. Samuel looked toward Victor. Because thousands of innocent employees depended on this business. I refused to destroy their future just to repair my past. Victor's face had turned pale. That's impossible. My father wasn't a thief. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket. He removed an old photograph, the same one Emily had seen in the archives. Only this copy was untouched. 3 smiling young engineers stood together beside the company's first rented office. Richard, Thomas, Samuel, friends, family, almost. Samuel handed the picture to Victor. Your father wasn't born dishonest. He became afraid. Success can make good people protect the wrong things. Victor stared silently at the photograph. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything he believed about his father. Harold cleared his throat. The board has protected Samuel's identity for 6 years. Victor looked up sharply. Protected? Harold nodded. When Samuel returned, he didn't ask for power. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a job. As a janitor. Gasps filled the room. Why? Someone whispered. Samuel smiled. I wanted to know what kind of company my dream had become. He looked directly at Victor. The only way to discover a company's character is to see how it treats the people nobody notices. The words landed like a hammer. No one dared speak. Emily suddenly understood everything. The emergency server, the hidden documents, the private club, the board's respect, the expensive fountain pen, the legal newspaper. Every clue had pointed to the truth. She had simply been looking for the wrong answer. Samuel had never been pretending to be important. He had been pretending to be ordinary. Victor slowly stood. His voice shook. He looked around the room, then at every employee standing near the doors. Finally, he faced Samuel. I'm sorry. Samuel remained silent. Victor swallowed hard. No, I'm not apologizing because of who you are. He lowered his head. I'm apologizing because of who I was. For the first time since becoming CEO, there was no arrogance, only regret. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he asked one question. If I were still only the janitor, would you still mean those words? Victor couldn't answer immediately. The silence itself became his confession. Finally, honestly, I don't know. Samuel nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said all morning. 3 months later, Langley Technologies looked very different. Victor remained CEO. The board refused his resignation. Instead, they ordered him to spend 1 day every month working alongside employees in maintenance, security, customer support, and shipping, not for publicity, not for cameras, for perspective. Emily was promoted to Director of Corporate Ethics. Margaret finally retired after 42 years. Frank, the security chief, admitted he had always suspected Samuel was far more than he appeared. And Samuel, he refused every executive office, every title, every luxury. He accepted only one request. The company restored his name beside the other founders at the entrance. Nothing larger, nothing grander, just the truth. Every morning afterward, new employees entering the building passed 3 bronze names: Richard Langley, Thomas Grayson, Samuel Carter. Most never knew the incredible story behind them, but everyone knew one company rule that Samuel personally wrote. The measure of leadership is not how you treat the people who can help your career, but how you treat the people who cannot. Victor stopped every morning to read those words. Not because anyone forced him, because he never wanted to forget the day he humiliated the man who had built his entire future. Success can hide the truth, titles can hide character, and appearances can hide extraordinary lives. The people we overlook today may have sacrificed more than we can imagine. Respect should never depend on someone's position. It should depend on our own character. If you discovered that the person you had underestimated was actually the one responsible for your success, would you have the courage to admit you were wrong, or would your pride stop you? Or would your pride stop you? Or would your pride stop you? Or would your